Okay, we'll let other people join in as we go. I want to welcome all of you to this evening's webinar, the Gaza and Ukraine Wars, Recent Developments, Geopolitical Implications, and Paths to Greater Peace and Justice. I'm Joseph Gerson with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. As we begin, I want to thank our wonderful tech volunteer, Mariana Fernandez, for making this session possible. Thanks to our co-sponsors, Peace Action New York State, Brooklyn for Peace, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Peace, Justice, and Sustainability Now in Pennsylvania. I don't think I need to say very much about the urgency of the moment. Israel has been traumatized by the October 7th mass murders and hostage-taking. An estimated 6,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed and at least 15,000 wounded, while the entire population of Gaza is suffering from devastating bombings, the siege which denies them water, electricity, fuel, and medicines that are essential for life. And we face the probability of a deadly Israeli ground invasion of Gaza with massive casualties on each side, and the dangers that the war could escalate into a full-scale regional war. Meanwhile, and now getting less attention, in Ukraine, we are approaching the end of the second year of a devastating war with what seems to be a stalemate and murderous trench warfare that is reminiscent of the futility of World War I. Each side is pursuing maximalist goals and appears determined to avoid serious negotiations until the 2024 US presidential elections have been held. Winter is coming, and we face the continuing danger of both horizontal and vertical escalation. And amidst the tectonic post-Cold War geopolitical changes, the outcomes of these two catastrophic wars are deeply integrated and may impact the rest of the world. In fact, they already are. The great powers, the global South, and the contest for Asia-Pacific hegemony. We're privileged this evening to have two uniquely experienced and committed experts to help us understand the backgrounds, recent disastrous developments, and suggested actions that we should be taking for peace and justice. I'm going to keep this introduction short so that we have more time for our speakers and for the question and answer period that will follow their initial presentations. First, a few words about format and logistics. Phyllis and Anatol will speak for up to 15 minutes, providing us with the overviews and their analysis and what we should be expecting in the coming weeks. Their talks will be followed by two brief announcements, and then we'll move into our question and answer period. If there is sufficient interest, which I expect there will be, we can continue until 8:30, at which point, out of consideration for our speakers, we'll be saying thank you very much, good luck, and good night. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and in the center of your screen. I'll do my best to keep track of them and to ask as many of them as time allows. I do need to appeal to you not to fill the Q&A function with chat-like comments. That would make it much more difficult for me to discern what the questions are and to move us through the webinar as productively as we want to be. I should also ask that this evening's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending the link to everyone who has registered. So let's get to it. I'll introduce them both, and then we'll begin with Phyllis. Phyllis Bennis is is a fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington. And I've been privileged to work with her for more years than probably either of us want to remember. At IPS, she directs the New Internationalism Project, which focuses on the Middle East, U.S. militarism, and UN issues. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, Phyllis helped to found the Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and more recently has spent 6 years on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, where she now serves as its international advisor. Phyllis works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the U.S. and around the world. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues, and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestine territory. Phyllis has written and edited 11 books. And among her latest is the 7th updated version of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. She is also the author of Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, as well as Challenging Empire. Then to Anatol Lieven. From 1985 to 1998, Anatol worked as a journalist in South Asia, in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and covered the wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Southern Caucasus. From 2000 to 2007, he worked at think tanks in Washington. He now directs the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. He has served as a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar and the War Studies Department of King's College in London. He also served as a member of the advisory committee of the South Asia Department of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and on the academic board of the Valdai Discussion Club in Russia. He holds a BA and PhD in history and political science from Cambridge University in England. Anatol is the author of several books on Russia and its neighbors, including Baltic Revolutions, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, Chechnya, Tombstone of Russian Power, ? And Ukraine and Russia, a Fraternal Rivalry. So with those introductions made, let me turn the floor over to Phyllis. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a little strange to think that we're doing a presentation tonight on Palestine, Gaza, and Ukraine, the two crisis zones. It took the massacre of October 7th and the ongoing massacre in Gaza to push Ukraine off the front pages for a while, but that crisis remains crucial. I've been thinking a lot about how we come to understand these crises, and I always come back to the notion that our understanding of history, our understanding of reality, often starts with when we start the clock. And it's particularly dangerous, I think, when we start the clock today, whenever today is, and particularly when there's a particular crisis that happens on a single day. So the crisis in Israel on October 7th was a horrific, very serious human crisis. And not surprisingly, it was shocking. It took us all by surprise, and it was a horrible thing to see. It, for a while, I think, pushed aside the ongoing horror of what existed in Gaza and had been going on, the 16 years of siege, the 5 separate bombing raids that had ranged from 1 week to 3.5 weeks and had led to the deaths of thousands, the attacks on nonviolent protests over the years, all of that. And so the other day when I was watching Biden's speech, luckily with a group of people at Busboys and Poets, where we had just finished a discussion with the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, and then moved to Biden's speech, it was rather astonishing to hear the plan for an additional $105 billion worth of military and militarized purchases around this country. And I started thinking about what Dr. King had taught us so long ago, that budgets are moral documents. In this case, we might say immoral documents. But in many ways, I think the hypocrisy and double standards that have been so central to US foreign policy for so long were so visible in that announcement. Dr. King's statement that the bombs in Vietnam explode at home, they destroy the dream and the possibility for a decent America, kept coming back to my mind. And I started thinking again about what this is going to mean in terms of what the US looks like to the rest of the world, the impact on the global South, the countries whose governments, as responsive or not responsive as they may be to public opinion, virtually all condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Certainly over the years, they have all condemned Israel's occupation and apartheid policies, but they wouldn't support, for example, the US sanctions against Russia because they don't see it in isolation from ongoing struggles. So the the issues of US sanctions and US sanctimony at the same time was very, very visible in that context. The things that Joseph mentioned earlier, the impact of 16 years of a siege and now an absolute tightened siege where no water and no electricity, no medicines can get in, where doctors are treating the thousands of wounded without anesthesia, doing surgery on children without anesthetics, holding them down on the steps of a lower level, perhaps, of what remains of the hospitals. The virtual destruction of Gaza, over 5,000 dead, half of them children. This is one of the astonishing things that we just don't think enough about until suddenly it gets even worse and we hear about it. And then suddenly we remember, I thought that I knew pretty much almost everything. I had read everything I could find from the UN agencies, from everybody else about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza over these last years, these last decades. But I read something the other day that just stunned me, that I had no idea, that under the 16 years of siege, before this siege, it was bad enough that 20% of Gazan children are stunted by the age of 2, because there's simply not enough quality food with protein, fresh vegetables, fruit. None of that is available. None of that is available. And the children are now showing it in their bodies. That's a whole generation where 25% of the children are stunted. And that's never going to be reversed. That's something we all are going to have to live with, and that the people of Gaza live with on a daily basis. So why would we be talking jointly about the crisis in Gaza and the crisis in Ukraine? We heard from President Biden that both Hamas and Russia are both trying to destroy democracies on their border. It's like, really? That's what's going on here? You know, if we want to look at David and Goliath, we're kind of on different sides in these different wars. Massive support historically since 1967, especially even before that, of course, but with the so-called special relationship that started in 1967, despite the existence of Israel as a Goliath carrying out occupation and apartheid for so many decades against the Palestinian people. That didn't stop US support. The US support for Ukraine, which was not, you can't really say Ukraine was a David in this context, but was certainly not Goliath. It was Russia that occupied Ukraine, not the other way around. So it's kind of a reversal there, but President Biden was trying to persuade us that it was all just the same thing. So of that $106 billion that he announced, $61.5 billion is going to go to Ukraine. 2/3 of it, almost, is going right to the military of Ukraine. Add to that the $67 billion that the US has already sent to Ukraine just for the military side. There's been about another $40 million for economic and humanitarian support, but $67 billion so far for military aid. That means a total of $123 billion of our tax money that's been given directly to the Ukrainian military in a year and a half. It's an extraordinary amount. The military budget of Ukraine is $30 billion. So we've already given, well, let's see, 30 is what, about a quarter of all that we've given this year. So you can do the math. Look at the math on the Israeli side. The amount of money that Biden announced the other night out of this $106 billion is $14 billion is going to go directly to the Israeli military. $14 billion. Add to that the almost $4 billion that the US has already given to the Israeli military, as it does every year, based on an MOU signed by President Obama. And you get $18 billion of our tax money just this year. Israel's total military budget this year is just under $24 billion. And we're now giving them $18 billion. That's 3/4 of their budget on top of their budget. It's an astonishing thing. And their budget is more than the total military budgets of Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, and Jordan combined. So there's something, as Martin Luther King would say, there's something way off on the morality side here when we look at how this is working. And then at the UN, we see the United States once again, this is not an old story, once again rejecting ceasefires. You know, we saw this in 2006 when Israel was at war in Lebanon, and then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice went to the UN and said, we don't need a ceasefire yet. There's not enough dead people yet. We have to wait a while. We saw it again in 2008 and 9 in what Israel called Operation Cast Lead against Gaza, and again in 2012, and again in 2018, and again in 2021. And each time, with these days and nights of bombing in Gaza, the world was calling for a ceasefire. Just a ceasefire, just stop the killing. And each time the US said, nope, not yet. We're not ready for a ceasefire yet. Not enough children have died yet. That's the reality of what this policy looks like. And in that context, you know, we see these continuing wars that the US has carried out, the wars that together made up what's called the global war on terror after 9/11, which we were told was all about preventing weapons of mass destruction, which, hello, never existed. We were told it was about human rights. Really? Whose exactly? We were told it was about diplomatic solutions, which were never allowed to be even considered. The tiny territory of Gaza, one of the most densely populated, tiny little strips of land in the world, has just been bombed in 1 week with more bombs than attacked Afghanistan in any year of that 20-year-long war. That's what the current Israeli policy, with our support, our money, our bombs, is doing to the population of Gaza. This isn't a war against Hamas. This is a war against the entire population of Gaza, and it's designed to make them leave. It's, of course, exacerbated when US provided warplanes with Israeli pilots fly over and drop leaflets that say, if you don't leave, you will be treated as partners in a terrorist organization, meaning we can kill you with impunity and no one will hold us responsible. The Israelis are safe saying that because so far nobody has held them accountable. And that's on us. That part is on us. So all of the reliance that the US likes to talk about the rules-based order, which has somehow somewhere along the line replaced actual international law, which exists like in a book, you can look it up. Rules-based order, that's somebody making it up. That doesn't exist anywhere, except as a rhetorical way of not talking about international law. But when you look up international law, you find a number of things that are illegal. One of them is that you can't punish people collectively. You can't punish a population for the actions of some group of people within that. So, for example,
Phyllis, this is just your 3-minute warning.
Okay. For example, what that means is that the actions of Hamas based in Gaza, who carried out a horrific illegal attack on October 7th, is an illegal attack. People should be held accountable. They should be condemned. And you cannot punish the entire population in response to that. That's what international law says. It also says that you can't carry out attacks on civilians, that you can't carry out attacks that don't distinguish between civilian and combatant areas, all of that. What we are seeing right now, and I will end with this part, is that there has been, over the last 25 years, a movement in this country and around the world designed to change the discourse, the narrative about what Israel represents, what Palestinian rights are all about. And we now have made incredible gains in that. Some of you may have seen the other day, the Wall Street Journal, of all places, an extraordinary article about the Nakba, what Palestinians, the word means catastrophe in Arabic, and it refers to the massive dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians from their land, from their homes. 750 Palestinians became refugees overnight in 1947 and 48. And the population of Gaza, 70% of it are those refugees and their descendants. So these are the people who are saying, we're not going to leave. We are not going to leave. And the movement that has been built in this country and around the world, we were seeing it this week with protests all around the country, around the world. On Wednesday, the protest that brought together hundreds and hundreds of Jewish activists from around the country, 300 of them arrested in the Cannon House office building. 25 of those arrested were rabbis. This is an amazing moment. This is a moment when 25% of American Jews and 38% of young Jews have told pollsters that they believe Israel is an apartheid state. The question is that going to change with the current crisis and the current escalation of rhetoric around that crisis? And one thing that we're seeing is that people are not buying the claims of the Biden administration. People are saying, and again, the polls are showing 78% of people in this country want a ceasefire. That has been the demand of every protest this past week and ongoing. The crisis now is for a ceasefire. That's the demand. And I urge everybody listening to call your members of Congress. There now is, I think, up to almost 20 signatures on the new ceasefire resolution that was introduced by Representative Cori Bush and Representative Rashida Tlaib. They need more signatures, whether or not we ever get a new Speaker of the House. There needs to be congressional support for that bill, and that means they can sign on to it. Sorry, it's not a bill, it's a resolution, which makes it even easier. Everybody should be calling their members of Congress. This is a moment when protesting in all ways is crucial, and the demand is a ceasefire now. We have to say no to the Condoleezza Rices of the world and all the other parts of US policy that said we don't need a ceasefire yet. We always need a ceasefire when war breaks out. It's always necessary to stop the killing. And that's what this is about. That's what this moment tells us. That's what Dr. King taught us. And that's the lesson that we have all learned, and we need to keep it up, keep up the pressure, keep up the protests, and keep demanding a ceasefire now. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Let me look at my here. Thank you. Oops, on and off. Thank you, Phyllis. I mean, that was, as always, very much on point, excellent, and inspiring. Just one little modification for people who don't know their history. You said 750 had been displaced by the Nakba. You meant 750,000, yes. So just for those who are listening who don't know that history. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Anatol. And it's a lot for everybody to take in, but it's the world we're living in now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I shall echo a great deal of what Phyllis said, which I entirely agree with. I would also link what is happening and the US response or non-response to certain aspects of US diplomacy, of the stated policies or previously stated policies of the Biden administration, which have been wrecked or put into abeyance by what is now happening. The first is climate change. Declared by the Biden administration when it came in to be an existential threat to the United States. And of course, responding to it, to be fair, very much at the heart of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. But the whole issue of climate change has simply disappeared from the headlines, and with rare exceptions from administration language. Since these wars began. Jake Sullivan, in his piece just published for Foreign Affairs, mentioned it, but very, very far down. Unless I missed something, President Biden did not mention it in his address at all. One of the reasons, of course, why one does have to try to preserve cooperation with other great powers around the world, even ones that one doesn't like, is for the sake of action against climate change. And yet, in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was miserably clear that nobody, and by the way, I include, well, Russia, it goes without saying, but European governments as well, on this, nobody was factoring the effects on action against climate change into any of their calculations about what was likely to happen in Ukraine. So there, once again, there is a radical misallocation of American attention and American resources. The second thing, which is, Phyllis mentioned aid, something that has astonished me ever since I first came to Washington, is the United States' extraordinary neglect of its immediate neighbors to the south, neighbors whose problems are vastly exacerbated both by the US appetite for drugs and the US war on drugs. The neglect has been astonishing. And if you look at the aid figures, in 2 years, well, this aid package alone, Ukraine has received more than 12 times as much as Mexico and the whole of Central America over the past 20 years. Despite the fact that, of course, American politicians, at least some of them, complain bitterly all the time about the problems for American society being caused by drugs and illegal migration. The only solution that some American politicians have now managed to come up with is the idea of deploying the US military to Mexico as part of the war on drugs, not something that will ever be accepted by the Mexicans. But if there were ever an indication of the moral and political bankruptcy of US primacy, even in its own hemisphere, you could hardly ask for a clearer example than that, while at the same time, enormous sums of money are poured into countries far from America's shores for ostensibly geopolitical reasons, though one might well question the rationale for this. A third point is very much responding to President Biden's address, in which he yet again used this phrase, or dug it up from the dead, the indispensable nation, that American leadership is essential for the world, that the world would go to hell if America did not dominate the whole of the world. Well, I don't have time to go into what's happening in the Far East. I've mentioned Central America. But if you look at the Middle East, I think one can say that while a different hegemon, Russia or China, might have made an even bigger mess than the United States has made of that region over the past 25 years, they would have had to work pretty hard at it. It would be hard indeed to find a bigger record of not just failure, but in many cases willful failure than US policy in this region. So on what basis, on what moral basis or evidential basis America is claiming primacy here, for me is very difficult to say. And that brings me to my last point, which is that the Biden administration has emphasized in its rhetoric the need to reach out to what we used to call the third world or the developing world. We are now learning to call it the global south, which is something of a misnomer, but never mind. In any case, the non-aligned or the well, not quite the non-white world, because there are also, of course, Japanese and South Koreans in it. And very much the need to reach out to this, but basically as part of the competition with China, that America needs to win over sympathy and support for these countries against China, and also to some degree against Russia. Now, everything that America has been doing and saying about Gaza has, in fact, worked to confirm absolutely in the eyes of people around the world, and not just in China and Russia, and in Latin America, but in countries that in principle wish to be US partners like India. But they have been confirmed in their view that the West really only takes notice of atrocities, or certainly only attempts to take action against atrocities, if they are A, committed by our geopolitical enemies or rivals, and B, that they are directed against white people. And this really does not go down well in the vast majority of humanity, who the United States administration says it wishes to appeal to, but in fact is showing enormous disrespect for. and a disrespect that is seen by a great part of the world as frankly racist. And one figure that I have seen, but which I have not seen noticed anywhere in the American mainstream media, is that, of course, people are and should be deeply concerned for the US Israeli citizens who were killed in the Hamas terrorist attacks, which were indeed unconscionable. And of course, deeply worried, more worried, it seems, than the Israeli government for the safety of the American citizens. But we should be worried about all the hostages taken to Gaza. But of course, the American government does have a particular responsibility, a legal, a moral responsibility to American citizens. But there are about 30 American citizen hostages of Hamas in Gaza, from what is believed to be the case. I have read that there are around 600 Palestinian American citizens in Gaza today under Israeli bombardment, and yet that is mentioned nowhere. Now, if that isn't an indication that in the American establishment there are American citizens first class and American citizens second class, it would be hard to see a clearer example of that. And once again, that is noticed elsewhere in the world, and it does the most terrible reputational damage to America and to America's diplomatic efforts. And Phyllis has said quite rightly that it is not that countries around the world sympathize with Hamas terrorism any more than they sympathized with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They denounced it. But what they greatly dislike is indeed these double standards. And the expectation in the case of the war in Ukraine that they will damage their own very important interests when it comes to energy security, energy prices, international food prices and food supplies, for the sake of American agendas, when America relentlessly prioritizes not just its own interests, but its own particular allegiances in what it does in the world. And once again, I mean, this causes great anger, and not just among, American rivals, but I was, having worked previously in India as a student and then a journalist, I was struck, given that the Indian government and much of the political class, or most of the political class, is very anxious for partnership with the United States. I was struck by the virulent criticism of America in much of the Indian media and the social media, because, once again, of this perception, justified in my view, of tremendous moral arrogance, but based on double standards and, in fact, immorality. One could say that this is ruinous for American interests in much of the world, but I have to say that largely because of what's happened in Israel, but not only, because of cynical and hypocritical American policies in other parts of the world, particularly, of course, when it comes to preaching democracy while backing dictatorships. The image of America was already in ruins. I taught for 7 years at Georgetown University campus in Qatar. Now, Qatar is anxious, of course, to be a partner of the United States. A great many of my students from other countries in the Middle East, from India, were also very anxious for American partnership. So it wasn't that they wished to destroy American power. But I have to say that in 7 years, not one of them, not one student believed that America represents a rules-based order in the world, or that America is really genuinely trying to promote democracy and human rights. And when you ask them,
Anatol, this is your 3 minutes.
Sure. And when you ask them why not, they would say, but why should we? I mean, look at America's record. What evidence do we have to believe this? So yes, a terrible series of blows going back many years to America's moral standing in the world. Now, talk honestly to some members of the American establishment, and they will say, look, yes, we did terrible things in Vietnam, but in the end, the world got over it, and it didn't stop us winning the Cold War. But today, of course, America, rightly or wrongly, that's another issue, has got itself into a Cold War with Russia and with China. And China is a vastly economically more powerful country than Russia, and vastly more appealing to much of the world than the Soviet Union ever was. And in these circumstances, if only for purely realist and cynical reasons, it is, I believe, necessary for the United States to pay attention to what is called in the Declaration of Independence, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. I'm going to come back and whoops. Thank you, Anatol. I'm going to come back with a question for each of you, and then go into the questions that have been building up in the Q&A function there. I do want to make two announcements with the help of Mariana Fernandez here. The first is I want to reiterate Phyllis's appeal for people to contact your members of Congress. I would add also to be writing letters to the editor and otherwise in support of House of Representatives Resolution number 786. It calls for de-escalation and a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war. Also, we can put it into the chat. The congressional switchboard is at 202-225-3121. You can call that number and ask to speak to your congressional representative or their office so that you can push for a ceasefire. And if for no other reason, ask that they support what, as Phyllis pointed out, was 2/3 of the American people wanting a ceasefire. So first of all, just to encourage you to call for the ceasefire. Secondly, the International Peace Bureau and two of our partner organizations tonight, co-sponsors, Peace Action New York State and Brooklyn for Peace, as well as the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Security, will be holding a forum, an international forum, on the evening of November 29th in New York at the time of the second meeting of states parties of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we'll be looking there at the urgency of moving toward nuclear disarmament and prevention of nuclear confrontations. We have a remarkable panel with Setsuko Thurlow, the Nobel Peace Laureate, Rainer Braun from the International Peace Bureau in Germany, Jackie Cabasso from Western States Legal Foundation here, Ahmad Kaye of the Middle East Treaty Organization, he's Iranian, Molly McGinty of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, and Tom Unterreiner of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So you've got the information there in the chat, and on we go. So one question for each of you. Anatol, I wonder if you could give us an expectation of what you think is going to happen in the Ukraine war as we move now into winter and with the apparent stalemate.
Well, yes. I mean, at present, it does look very like a stalemate. And that is partly for reasons to do with recent developments in technology, which do, to some extent, echo those in a different way before the First World War, in that they have greatly strengthened the power of the defensive against the offensive. We have seen the Russian offensive blunted at the start of the war and then driven back. Now the Ukrainian offensive in the south has been stopped dead. And the Russian attack around Avdiivka is also, it seems, proceeding very slowly. now, and that I think will probably remain the case for some time. However, US aid notwithstanding, in many respects, time is not on the Ukrainian side here. The Russian population, especially since so much of the Ukrainian population has fled, outnumbers that of Ukraine by around 4 to 1 or more. And the other thing that this war has demonstrated is that while, of course, ultra-modern high-tech weaponry is very important, paradoxically enough, this war has also emphasized the tremendous importance of huge numbers of conscript soldiers. And Russia, frankly, can just conscript a lot more people than Ukraine has, particularly because, of course, Ukrainian casualties have been so enormously high. So in calling for a ceasefire, I think we should also make the argument very strongly that doing this is not an anti-Ukrainian position. That at the moment, the Ukrainians have won both in terms of Russian ambitions when Moscow launched this invasion, which was to subjugate the whole of Ukraine, and in terms then of the next Russian plan, which was to annex very large additional parts of Ukraine, and in terms of the history of the past 350 years of domination of Ukraine by Moscow. Ukraine has won, with Western help, a great victory. More than 80% of Ukraine is now independent and will never, as things stand at the moment, return to Russian suzerainty. Now, of course, it's a qualified victory, not an absolute victory. But my fear is that if we do not seek a ceasefire, if we go on encouraging the Ukrainians to keep attacking, that we could be setting them up for a much more serious defeat in future, given the basic underlying balance of forces and strength between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, because whatever the Biden administration may say, Western support, certainly this level of Western support for Ukraine, cannot be guaranteed in the long run. An awful lot depends on what happens in the next US elections. An awful lot depends on what happens in future European elections. And 2 years from now, barely a year from now, we will have we may have, who knows, a different US administration, but Russia will still be there. So once again, calling for a ceasefire is not an anti-Ukrainian position.
Thank you, Anatol. That reflects my thinking just about precisely. The question I want to ask to Phyllis is one that came in from Ann Wright, and you'll notice some connections with her personal history. She'd like you to comment on the registration of Josh Paul from the State Department, and what that reflects in terms of wider unhappiness in the State Department and in aspects of the administration.
I think this is a very important public statement. One can argue, that the kind of moral assertion that he made, that he spent 11 years, this is a guy who was in the Department of the State Department section that deals with providing military equipment and support through the State Department. And he said from the time he started, he always had to be weighing the moral challenges. And somehow he managed to weigh that challenge and come down on the side of staying there for 11 years. But now he resigned in a very highly visible public way. Lots of publicity, lots of press. And I think what that says is he's seeing that he's not the only one. He's, I would hope, leading a more public lineup of people who will, if they either resign or refuse to do certain areas of work, which can result, of course, in them getting fired. Ann Wright, for those of you who don't know her, a great friend of mine, I'm proud to say, and in this context, what's so important is that Ann was both in the military for many years and a diplomat, a high-ranking diplomat, and was the first ranking diplomat to resign her position in protest of the Iraq War, and has been an active activist against war ever since, and has played an incredibly important role and a role model for, I think, not only all of us in the anti-war movement, but more importantly, in some ways, for other people in the State Department, in the military, to say, I can't do this. This is immoral. This goes against everything I believe. And people can leave and survive and have a life that's fabulous and even better than the life perhaps that they had earlier. So all of that is particular to Anne Wright's own history, which I'm always appreciative of. But I think that it does speak to what we're hearing still at the level of rumors. We're hearing rumors that there were 400 people in the State Department that signed off on some kind of internal private channel expressing discontent. Whether those numbers are true, I don't know. I don't have an inside source. I'd love to be a fly on the wall of that set of meetings, but I'm not. So all I can say is I hope it's true, and I hope that there will be many more like him who will make the judgment, maybe even earlier in their careers, that this is not acceptable. This is not what I signed up for.
Thank you, Phyllis.
On the record, there has been a major revolt by European Union officials against the stance taken by the European Union President von der Leyen, but that has come out into the open.
And I would say, just on that, I didn't mention it before, but it's one of the things that I think is shaping the decision-making in Israel right now about when and if there's going to be a ground invasion. I think the if is now a very real question, in a way that it was not a real question 5 or 7 days ago. And part of it has to do with the split within the European Union.
That's encouraging, Phyllis. We have a broad participation in this webinar, including from as far away as Japan. And so we have a question from Japan directed to Anatol, asking when might the Ukrainian wheat, which is being held in Romania, be released so that the Japanese can get their share, and by extension, obviously, other nations in the global South as well.
Well, not soon, I fear, because Russia was under pressure, precisely because Russia has been reaching out to the global South. The complaints made to Moscow and to Foreign Minister Lavrov when he toured Africa about the blockade of the Ukrainian wheat did have a real effect in Moscow, in leading them previously to make the deal brokered by Turkey to allow Ukrainian grain exports. But they also expected, and whether they were promised this informally is not clear, but they certainly expected that there would be a certain relaxation of Western sanctions when it came to paying for Russian exports of food and Russian exports of food-related goods, notably fertilizers. Now, that didn't happen. I think that to get Russia to return to the deal, there would have to be a certain relaxation of sanctions in those specific areas. And that would seem to me quite legitimate if indeed we are interested in the food security of the rest of the world. It would also be a sign to Moscow that there is at least some flexibility in the Western position. In other words, that in return for certain Russian moves, we are prepared to give something on our side. Because when it comes to negotiations, now, people sometimes ask me, what is Putin thinking? And I say, well, the last time we cracked a bottle of vodka together, all he could do was talk about his problems with his girlfriend. We didn't get round to Ukraine at all. In other words, what the hell do I know what Putin is thinking? But what we do know is that the present position set out by Ukraine, even written into law by Ukraine and backed by the United States, that the only basis for negotiations is complete Russian withdrawal from everything occupied by Russia since 2014, including Crimea, is a non-starter. That is not negotiable from a Russian point of view. And it's very, very difficult to see in realistic terms how Ukraine will be able to win anything territorially, at least unless it were to make significant concessions in other areas, that it has not won on the battlefield. So, I mean, the point is that we don't know what Russia's basic negotiating position is, because they haven't been talking about it. At the beginning of the war, we knew. Now, very difficult to say. But our basic negotiating position is, in fact, not a negotiating position at all. It rules out negotiations at present.
So, thank you. I've got two questions for Phyllis. Maybe we'll take them one at a time. A couple of people have asked about why we're not more critical of Hamas, given its charter and its stated commitment to eliminating the state of Israel with the terrorist attacks that have been a part of that. How do we respond to questions about Hamas?
I think that I and many others have been very clear that the actions of Hamas were completely illegal, in my view, immoral, outrageous. And that if we're serious about preventing actions like that, we have to deal with what many people don't want to talk about, which is root causes. Actions of horrific violence, like the actions that we saw on October 7th, don't come out of thin air. They come in response to people's real world experiences. And in this case, that means decades, lifetimes for half the population of Gaza, which is under the age of 18. That's 1 million and more than 1 million people under the age of 18 who have known nothing but siege and apartheid, who have never been allowed to leave this crowded little tiny strip of land, have never been inside Israel, have never been able to visit the West Bank, let alone experience the broader world, and have lived a life of deprivation with no particular hope ahead of that changing anytime in their coming lifetime. That in no way justifies the actions against civilians that were carried out on October 7th. And if we don't understand that there's reasons that those actions happen, those illegal, horrific actions, which we must condemn, and we must demand that people be held accountable for their actions, if we don't understand that those happen because of something, and we have to change those somethings if we want them to not happen again, then we're in trouble. Then we just wait for the next outburst. So I think that's part of the question. I also think it's important to recognize, in the case of Hamas, it's of a very vast and varied organization, which goes far beyond its military wing. It has a political wing, it has an economic wing, and it's a political party that had much support from Israel at the time that it was created in 1987. It had funding, it had permission, because Israel saw it as an alternative, a more controllable alternative than the secular nationalism of the PLO. Israel didn't create it. It had its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood that began in Egypt and is very much a regional phenomenon. But its emergence as a separate organization in Gaza in 1987 was very much with Israeli acquiescence. And they believed for a long time that they could control it, and in fact were controlling it in their view. Turned out they were not controlling it at all. So I think that it's important, one, to recognize that the horror of October 7th is what it is. It's a horror, it's illegal, it must be condemned, there must be accountability. And it grew out of real challenges that people face in their lives. And the judgment of it, I think, crucially must be of those actions more than what's in the charter. The charter of the Likud party has a map that says there will never be an there will never be a Palestinian state anywhere in between the river and the sea. I'm less interested in what is in the Likud charter than in what their party does when they are in power in the Knesset, which they happen to be at the moment, with their far right, and I would say carefully choosing the word fascist right partners in that coalition government. So I'm less interested in what the charters of any of these groups say than I am in what they do. What they do needs to be condemned and stopped. What they say, I'm less worried about.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit? In the US government policy remains, theoretically, a two-state solution.
Yeah.
That has been the official policy of US administration since the 1990s. Now, two forces in particular have set out to destroy that possibility, that plan. And as Phyllis said, they have even to a degree worked together. The first is obviously Hamas, which rejected it and has done its, well, of course, it is best to destroy the PLO, has destroyed the PLO in Gaza. And the other, as Phyllis says, has been a succession of Israeli governments who have destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution by their settlement policy. And indeed, you know, Netanyahu, great evidence to suggest, I was reading a piece about this in Haaretz just the other day, that indeed he deliberately built up Hamas so that he would not have to talk with the PLO about a two-state solution. Now, that was in direct contradiction, not just of US policy, but of course also of US interests when it comes to the threat of international terrorism. So yes, we've got to look at the background of this on both sides. And I can condemn not just the terrorism of Hamas, but I also condemn its blind rejection of any possible deal with Israel. But indeed, you have to look at the other people, the other side, which has rejected, in effect, any deal.
And like so many political organizations, there are splits within and divisions within Hamas. So some Hamas leaders have said they are prepared to negotiate not a two-state solution, because everybody on the ground knows there's no more land for it. So that's just not going to happen. But the one other thing I would say is that the calls for a ceasefire, for example, mean a ceasefire on all sides. This is not a one-sided thing. The resolutions at the United Nations that the US vetoed were calling for cessation of hostilities and humanitarian pause on all sides.
All sides, yes.
So this is crucial. This is what people are calling for, is an end to all the violence right now. That doesn't solve the problem, but it stops the killing.
By the way, on that score, just to go back to Ukraine for a second, the idea of a treaty of neutrality has been, of course, denounced as, you know, a Russian ploy. Well, of course, it is a Russian demand, but very, very few people have noticed that a treaty of neutrality based, for example, on the Austrian state treaty during the Cold War also rules out what used to be a key aim of Putin and the Russian government, which was to bring Ukraine into an alliance with Russia. It cuts both ways. Neutrality means neutrality, as with Austria during the Cold War. It can't be a military ally either of Russia or of the West. While, of course, in the case of Austria, leaving it, or Finland for that matter, leaving it completely open for Ukraine to move towards the West, to develop as a Western democracy and free market society, if, well, with our help and if it can.
Sorry, Joseph, there's one aspect I must respond to. I fully agree with what Anatol just said about Ukraine, but I think we have to be very careful here that the parallels do not match.
Oh, sure.
Ukraine and Russia are both sovereign countries. Palestine and Israel are not. The Palestinians living in Gaza are without a state. without a government that has any power, without control of their own land, their own territory, their own borders, their own airspace, their own electrical grid, their water, their coastlines, anything. And no one is proposing that even a two-state solution would mean Palestinian control of any of those things. The so-called state that was once on the agenda did not allow any of this. This is an occupied population and an occupying power. So the power relationship is not the same, and the obligations are not the same. Both sides have the obligation to abide by international humanitarian law, which are the rules of war. No killing of civilians, no targeting civilian targets, no collective punishment. But they do not have the same obligation in terms of whether they can go to war at all. An occupied population has the right of even armed self-defense if necessary, if they do not break the resolutions of not attacking civilians, etc. So we do have to be careful not to say on this one, the situation is very, very different in terms of what the rights and obligations are of each side, whether it's two independent countries or an occupied population and an occupying power.
Quite true.
So then to follow up on the question of having a foundation for any kind of national self-determination, two related questions here. One question is the goal of Israel in Gaza ethnic cleansing, and in a related way, what can you tell us about what's happening in the West Bank while all eyes are on Gaza?
Yeah, the answer to both parts of that are very, very bad news. In the West Bank, there's been over 100 people killed in this last 2-week period that the eyes of the world have been on Gaza. The settlers have been on a rampage. The biggest reason that there were no soldiers available to protect the kibbutzim on the border at the time of the attack on October 7th was that the vast majority of the soldiers who had once been deployed surrounding Gaza, surrounding the Gaza fence, had been redeployed to the West Bank through most of the last 9 or 10 months that this new government has been in power, because their focus, their political base is the settler movement in the West Bank. And they were deploying troops to protect the settlers as they carried out pogrom after pogrom against Palestinian towns and villages throughout the West Bank, not Gaza. Their focus has been on the West Bank. That's the land they want. They have uprooted olive trees by the hundreds. They have attacked villages, driven people out of their homes, demolished homes, while the soldiers stood by to protect them if any Palestinian dared to fight back. Most of the time, it was the settlers and not the soldiers carrying it out. In some instances, the soldiers themselves carried out these attacks with the settlers. But the soldiers were always there to protect the Israeli settlers against any level of self-defense. So the constant repeat that we hear from the White House, from Congress, Israel has the right of self-defense. Yes, and do Palestinians have the right of self-defense? Apparently not. It's never acknowledged, it's never claimed, it's never granted. So that's what's been happening in the West Bank. In Gaza, the answer around ethnic cleansing is yes. There are a set of international laws that if you violate the actions that are prohibited, they mean ethnic cleansing. If you carry out those same actions, those same illegal actions, which I'll tell you in a minute, with a specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, religious, ethnic, or other group, it's called genocide. And those actions, there are 5 of them. Israel is currently carrying out 3. One is killing people in the group. The second is injuring people in the group. The third is creating conditions that make the continuing existence of the group in their space impossible. Israel is doing all 3 of those. And there has been a plethora of examples of specific intent to destroy the group of Palestinians living in Gaza, mainly by driving them out, the rest by death. That's what a siege means. When you deny people water, it's a matter of days before they begin to die. If you deny people clean water and force them to rely on contaminated water, brackish water, or salt water, because the desalinization plants can't function because even now with these paltry few truckloads of supplies that have come in, no fuel is available. What that means is that within a matter of days, we will be seeing waterborne diseases like cholera and others that have been wiped out in that area for decades, but are coming back now because there's no way to prevent them and there's no medicines to treat them. So children are going to die and old people are going to die and babies are going to die. They're the most vulnerable to waterborne diseases. And we're going to be seeing that, as well as the thousands of people that are dying under the bombs. 700 people yesterday. 700 people known, probably many more because so many people are being killed under the collapsed buildings. And there simply is no way to make the priority to pull out dead bodies when there are so many still living that maybe have a chance to be saved and maybe not. So the reality of ethnic cleansing is definite. The question of whether it is legally enough yet to say that it is attempted genocide, there are now calls out to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate precisely that issue. Is this a violation of the international covenant against the crime of genocide? It's also a violation of the Rome Statute, which is the statute that created the International Court and determines what both the crimes are that would be considered and the jurisdiction. And in both those cases, this is relevant. The request to the prosecutor, which began several years ago after the 2014 assault on Gaza, was very clear that it should investigate all violations of international law and international humanitarian law that have been carried out in that territory, in the territory of the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories, in which the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction. It does not have jurisdiction inside Israel, but it does in the Palestinian territories. And in that context, the prosecutor opened an investigation, but there's been no work moving it forward. And that's what the demand is now. Get moving, make it real. There was already an agreement, the judges agreed and the prosecutor agreed to push this forward, but the current prosecutor, the British guy, has done nothing to make it real. And that's the demand. We need a ceasefire and there needs to be an investigation of war crimes on all sides. There needs to be accountability on all sides.
So thank you. It's sobering to say the least. Just to say, also on the question of sobering, I'm looking at now 55 questions in the Q&A box, which we're not going to get to. A little bit of compassion for our speakers. One question that I think applies to both of you here is, could you elaborate on the implications, the consequences of the inability of the House of Representatives to meet, let alone pass legislation on both the Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza wars?
I'm not going to say a word about the issue of the lack of a Speaker of the House. I will say that if there were political will, there are all kinds of ways that could be moved to support a ceasefire, to vote on the ceasefire resolution. That could happen. It's a question of political will. It's not. These are not laws that are immutable. These are regulations and traditions that can be ignored at will. The problem is political will.
I would just like to say that it is clear now that in Europe as well as in America, our democratic systems are in pretty serious trouble, and that ought to be a strong motivating factor. And once again, I think the Biden administration acknowledges that to some extent when it comes to what has been called the Green New Deal, or formerly the Inflation Reduction Act. But there is a really urgent need to concentrate on our deep problems at home. The other thing, though, coming out of that is, once again, I mean, looking at what's going on in the House of Representatives, it is simply not possible for any US official honestly to guarantee that a US support at this level for Ukraine will continue, certainly not indefinitely. The US political system is by now simply too divided and too dysfunctional to be able to give guarantees like that for the long term. But once again, at that point, what is in the best interests of Ukraine when it comes to finding a way to end this war?
So a couple of questions on the same line. I'm going to ask one from George Friday, who I have to commend for her persistence in being able to register. She asked, is AIPAC still holding members of Congress hostage to the money in politics that supports unconditional support for Israel? I'm reminded how AIPAC drove Cynthia McKinney out of U.S. politics. So what is the role of AIPAC? And a related question, why is there such an absence of criticism of what Israel has been doing, is doing in the U.S. Congress?
I think all of that is changing. It has been changing for the last 25 years, and in the last 5 or 6 years, we've been seeing the results of that change. There is no question, and it's not only AIPAC. There's AIPAC until 2 years ago was not a PAC, was not actually a money-giving institution. It was an institution that coordinated and bundled a lot of other organizations' money. But the key question about George's question about the role of the pro-Israel lobbies, both the Jewish-led lobbies, the more traditional ones, and the newer ones in the Christian Zionist movement, the mainly evangelical Christians who are particularly influential in the Republican Party, where the concentration is now of support for Israel. Support for Israel has become a thoroughly partisan issue. It's now a Republican Party issue, where Democrats, 44% of Democrats say Israel is like apartheid. That's a huge shift. But the contradiction is there's an enormous divide between the Democratic Party and the Republicans, maybe, I'm not sure about them, but the Democratic Party and the electeds of that party. So the base of the Democratic Party is what's reflected in those polls. The people who are elected are not, partly because of money. It isn't only that, but it's partly that. And the answer is, to George's question, yeah, there is still a lot of money. The difference is 10, 15 years ago, 25 years ago, certainly, when I was a kid growing up Jewish in California, it was definitely true that organizations like AIPAC and the other parts of the pro-Israel lobbies could deliver two things. They could deliver money, and usually it wasn't money given to a candidate. It was the threat that money would be given to an opponent if you didn't toe the line. So it was a little bit distinct in that way. But the other thing they could deliver were votes. There was this theory that the Jewish vote could be delivered by these Jewish organizations. I'm not sure if that was ever true. I think it was probably true to some degree when I was a kid. It certainly is not true now. And the problem is that part of the reason we're seeing an escalation of domestic repression of critics of Israeli policy, particularly among students who tend to be very vulnerable, is that those organizations that still have a lot of money, there's going to be another generation before that money gets transferred to the next generation down, but they can't deliver the votes. They've lost that ability. They're losing their supporters, and they know it. And so they're lashing out, so that we now see very little effort by AIPAC and other Israel lobby groups to persuade people to support their position. They know they've lost the narrative battle. So what they're doing now is using raw power to get state governments, city councils to pass resolutions criminalizing support for BDS, for instance. So all of that is going on. It's a little bit subtle, because we're saying, on the one hand, I'm saying that we're having these great strides in changing the discourse, and that's true. And we're getting backlash from it. We're feeling the heat, because those who have been in power all these years, who controlled the discourse of how people in this country saw and see Israel versus how they see the Palestinians, they don't have that power anymore. They do have money still, because that was a generational thing. And that's what's changing. And there's a lot of fear in those circles, because they know that when the young people, the people who said, 38% of young Jews say that Israel is an apartheid state, and only, still a lot, but only 25% of people above, I think the higher level was above 35, say that Israel is an apartheid state. So they're worried. They're very worried, and they should be, because they're losing their influence. And that's enormous. The problem is, it isn't only a matter of lobbies. I don't think AIPAC has to lobby President Biden to get him to immediately embrace Bibi Netanyahu and carry out this kind of bear hug diplomacy. Nobody had to convince him to do that. This is his own view, because he is also a product of that kind of education and all of that in this country that so many people of his generation grew up in. And that's true of non-Jews as well as Jews. So, all of that is still a huge challenge that we have to deal with in terms of education, in terms of how the discourse goes forward. But what we're seeing is, this time around, as bad as the press has been in some ways, we've also seen more Palestinian voices in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and on the front page stories of NPR and MSNBC. And yes, there's been backlash, and yes, we've lost ground, but we're still moving forward on that. And I think that's a huge tribute to the Palestinian rights movement, that are now out in the streets calling on people to call your member of Congress, organize house parties, to call collectively to say we need a ceasefire now.
So I want to follow up with a question from Kevin Martin that I'm going to embroider just a little bit. Kevin asked Phyllis to comment on the possibility of Israel squandering the sympathy that it justifiably garnered after Hamas's attack with the siege of Gaza. And I'd add to that your take. I remember reading, Hannah Arendt, writing in 1948, saying that whether it's right or wrong doesn't matter, but that the world's Jews will be held accountable and judged by what Israel does. And so I'd like your take on how you think the siege and the increasing awareness of Israeli apartheid will play in relationship to the standing of Jews and the security of Jews.
Well, on the first part, in terms of Israel losing public support, I think we can look at the model of 9/11. There's all kinds of differences. I don't want to equate 9/11 to what happened on October 7th in Israel, but there are certain parallels as well. A shocking, violent attack on civilians in both cases. And in both cases, massive human immediate sympathy. The French newspapers headlining, "Nous sommes tous Américains maintenant." We are all Americans now. The French never say that. And within a week, they weren't saying it anymore, because George Bush had squandered, within a week, actually within 3 days, but that's okay, give him a week, had squandered all of that by saying that the answer to this horrific crime was going to be to take the world to war. And the rest of the world was saying, wait a minute, wait, stop. And they didn't stop. And we mobilized around the world. Kevin and Joseph and George, all of us were part of that mobilization to say no. The world said no to war on February 15th, 2003. And the war went ahead without the world's permission. But I think what we've learned is that those protests had enormous impact later. We didn't realize it. The folks that organized February 15th, 2003 in Egypt were some of the same people who led the Arab Spring to overthrow a US-backed dictator in 2011. So there was a link. That link of history, the arc of history, the arc of protest also bends towards justice. We don't always get it the first time around. But yes, Israel has already stopped being the unadulterated good guy in this situation, because being the victim of a horrific crime doesn't give you the right to turn on 2 million other people who didn't commit that crime and take it out on them, which is precisely what Israel is doing now. So yes, they are going to lose a lot of support. The other linked question, but separate, about is this going to make anti-Semitism stronger? Is this going to mean Jews are at greater risk? I think the answer is yes. The Israeli state, Netanyahu and the Knesset members, continually claim that they are the state not of their citizens. Israel is not a state of all its citizens. It is, it declares, a state of all the Jews. And those of us who are Jewish and say, excuse me, not me, don't count me in there, not in my name, you don't speak for me. And there's plenty of Jews around the world saying precisely that. But nonetheless, at the official level, they say that and do not get contradicted by the leaders of other states who say, excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister, but it seems to me that the Jews in my country don't really see you as their leader. Part of the problem, we saw that when Trump was in power, he goes to Israel, makes all these concessions for these incredibly extremist positions, comes back and brags about them, meets with a group of wealthy Jewish Republicans, and says to them first, describing his decision to recognize the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights, which belongs, of course, to Syria, as Israel, as Israeli territory. And he looks out and he says, I was talking to your prime minister when I said that. And not one of them raised their hands and said, excuse me, Mr. President, we're not Israelis. He's not our prime minister. You're our president. These are Republicans. They probably thought that was a good thing. But whatever they thought, no one called him out and said, what kind of anti-Semitism is that? To say that because we're Jewish, that somehow we're not really American. Because his next line, he singled out the biggest funder to the Republican Party, Sheldon Adelson, and his wife Miriam. And he said, Sheldon and Miriam, I did it for you. This was the next part when he was talking about Jerusalem, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. What kind of evidence do you need that you are responding to Jewish money, something that Ilhan Omar was pilloried for talking about how lobbies function, when she talked about the tobacco lobby, Big Pharma, the gun lobby, and the Israel lobby all together. But what was singled out was that she had talked about the Israel lobby and said it was anti-Semitism. When the president then, Donald Trump, carried out that kind of an anti-Semitic reference, and no one called him out for it. So does this mean that anti-Semitism gains from that? Absolutely. The Trump administration endorsed anti-Semitism in their actual policies. We have not yet seen the kind of horrific escalation that we are seeing with Islamophobia right now, with the killing of that horrific killing of the 6-year-old boy in Illinois and the almost killing of his mother, who were Palestinian Muslims, by their landlord who had decided suddenly that Palestinian Muslims had to be the enemy and had to be killed. Are we going to see more of that? Let's hope not. Let's hope we can fight against it. But the reality is that the false accusations of anti-Semitism that are so often used as a weapon against critics of Israel who have nothing to do with anti-Semitism make it much harder to fight against the real violent anti-Semitism that's rooted in white supremacy and racism in this country. It makes it much harder to fight against that. And that's what we're now facing.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Phyllis. The last question is going to go to Anatol, actually sort of two interrelated questions. One is a question asking, might a factor fueling the Ukraine war be geopolitical positioning for Ukraine, rather for control over the Northern Sea route and the resources newly accessible in the melting Arctic? I'd expand that to ask how you see the geopolitical implications of the war, and maybe just to polish it up a little bit, to ask you to comment on the relationship between the two wars.
Well, last week, a colleague at the Quincy Institute, George Beebe, and I published an article saying that the Biden administration should really reach out to Russia and to China in an effort to prevent the war in Gaza from spreading. And that came out on the day that President Biden made his address, absolutely linking support for Israel in Gaza to support for Ukraine. So I felt a bit like the poor guy who published the famous case. He published his PhD on the stability of the East German communist system in the summer of 1989. But I mean, I think, Biden has talked about how Israel must not repeat the mistakes of America after 9/11. But in one critical area, that is precisely what the Biden administration is doing. It is doing its utmost to drive different rivals of the United States, or enemies, one can say, together. There is no evidence of any link between Russia and Hamas. I mean, on the contrary, there has actually been a very good relationship in many ways, between Russia and the Israeli government, based partly on, God help us, good chemistry between Putin and Netanyahu, but also on a perception of common hostility to Sunni Islamist terrorism. But the Biden administration is now giving Russia every incentive to try to worsen America's problems in the Middle East. And of course, if, God forbid, the war spreads to include Hezbollah and Iran, then Russia can give very, very significant help in terms of satellite intelligence, in terms of missile technology. So I would say the wars are not linked, or should not be linked, but unfortunately the US administration is linking them. So I have really deep fears from that point of view. But you can also say that this is implicit in the way in which, since 1992, when it came out, every subsequent US administration, with the partial exception of Barack Obama, but certainly not of his Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, have in effect adopted as their standard operating procedure what's been called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which said that America must exert unilateral hegemony, not just in the world as a whole, but in every region of the world. And no other country will have any influence beyond its borders, except that explicitly allowed to it by the United States. Well, that, as by the way, I mean, wise people commented at the time, but has now been completely forgotten by the establishment. That is an inevitable recipe for not just a pushback against America in many parts of the world, but how that pushback will inevitably become linked. I mean, I taught international relations. This is International Relations 101. I sometimes wonder, frankly, what they teach American diplomats now. As far as the Arctic is concerned, for me, this is the clearest case of how we are stuck. And by the way, I would say this absolutely of the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians as well. But we are stuck with what has been called residual elites and residual institutions who have been absolutely shaped, who are completely committed to a view of security which is entirely concerned with great power, rivalries, hard security. This is not what climate change in the Arctic is about. It does not matter if the Chinese and Russians sail some more ships around there. They're not going to attack Canada or Australia across the Arctic, for God's sake. What matters is that the Arctic ice cap is melting. What matters is that the permafrost is melting and releasing methane into the atmosphere. The Arctic is the area that really presents the threat of tipping points, as they've been called, feedback loops, whereby climate change becomes runaway, escapes from our control, and leads to catastrophe for the whole of humanity, including the United States. That's what we ought to be worried about in the Arctic. Not that the Chinese can sail, or the Russians can sail a few more ships around there. But I'm afraid our elites just have not, they sometimes tick the boxes on climate change, but they have not come to terms with that new reality and that new threat.
Thank you, Anatol. Only to add that the great power competition and its impacts on climate change, which is to say the inability to address it, not linked to the Arctic, but is, if you will, universal. At this point, I'm going to, as I said in the beginning, I'm going to thank both of our speakers, and wish you good night, and wish you good night's sleep, and know that we've got to get up in the morning and do variations of this all over again. And I want to thank our audience for joining us, for hanging in there for an hour and a half. I hope you will take lessons from this. We'll follow up with appeals for ceasefire, both in relationship to Israel-Gaza, but also in relationship to the Ukraine war. We'll follow up with links to this recording of this webinar for you to study it again and for you to share with your friends. And all I can say is work for peace, justice, the climate, and be willing to make sacrifices. If it's important enough to you, if life and peace are important enough to you, then live that way. Thank you so much, and thanks again to our speakers and to Mariana and to our co-sponsors.
Here, and thank you so much. Good night.
Night.